So you are very famous for making documentaries and mostly making documentaries. So I'd like to know how long have you been filmmaking and making documentaries for, and kind of how did you first get involved with filmmaking and documentaries?
I've been making documentaries for, I would say, a little over 10 or 12 years now. My master's is actually in literature. I returned home to Bozeman after finishing my master's at University of British Columbia, where I studied a lot of nonfiction writing, so I was really interested in nonfiction communication, and then I started doing writing for documentary. My first project that I directed was Class C, which is a story about 5 tiny towns in Montana and the basketball teams in those towns, and it follows the girls from those tiny towns to the state championship, but it's really about social change in, I would say, the Great Plains, in much of rural America. What's happened recently with shifts in agriculture and sort of the end of a dryland farming experiment, I would say.
All right, so you got your master's in literature, so then what made you kind of get involved into filmmaking?
Yeah, so the transition from literature to filmmaking really happened through the bridge of writing. I started writing for documentary and doing research, and then I just became more interested in the form. I'm still not a shooter. Occasionally I'll pick up a camera when I sort of have to, but I would definitely think of myself as following the storylines in a way that's probably typical for someone that comes from a more narrative background. And while I love, of course, visual storytelling is very important in documentary, I would definitely say the bread and butter of my knowledge and my attentions are to story.
All right, so then with that in mind, so what exactly is your job usually then when you're making a documentary? Like, what specifically is your job?
So my jobs vary depending on the kinds of projects I'm involved in. I've directed 3 projects on my own, and those projects I've also edited and written. So I'm doing the writing and the editing. I'm making a lot of my story choices after I have footage, but as a director I'm also interviewing and conceiving of things in the beginning. I also work on documentaries though that are for television or for broadcast, and in that capacity I'm usually writing and editing.
So you say that your main role in like documentaries is like writing for documentaries. I'm curious, kind of, how does writing for documentary work? You know, because it's a very kind of organic thing. How do you go about like organizing yourself when making a documentary and writing? Like, do you have to storyboard, and like just kind of what's the writing process like for documentary as opposed to like other types of film?
Yeah, I'm certainly nonfiction versus fiction filmmaking. When you're dealing with the real world, you're preparing yourself for real things to happen in a way that you might not be when you're working in fiction. So I would say that whenever I'm working on a project, before I have the footage, I sort of am starting to imagine in some way how things might fit together or what I might want. There's always a lot of writing that happens before you're even gathering footage. And then after I have footage collected or what I'm dealing with, sometimes writing is just about pulling those things into act structures or watching how the movement is going to work across the film. And sometimes writing literally is writing narration. If you have a narrator, you're providing the connective tissue that's either compressing time in your piece, or it's providing additional information, filling people in, setting a scene, helping someone get from point A to point B.
You know, it's not like you can write a screenplay for a documentary, so it's like I'm just trying to figure out exactly what the writing is like for that.
Well, a lot of the time when I am working with something where I might not be including my voice or my own character, I'm really using the things that my interviewees have said. That's sort of like, those become the foundation for what I'm going to do. So then I just I transcribe everything, go through, listen to everything, type it out, start to find the themes and threads that are connecting things, and then literally move around those sentences like in a document. and start to see how things are taking shape. Sometimes, I mean, perhaps even in your case, you'll want to have your voice explaining your project. You will be included in this documentary because it seems like a documentary about you making a documentary, but maybe it's just about other people making a documentary. But you can start to see what's emerging in each of the characters. And it's interesting because I really try when I'm dealing with interviews to you can have people cluster around subjects. So you could have Theo and I talking about similar things, but you could also have me represent one aspect of filmmaking, kind of try to narrow my the ways that I appear into one thread while Theo carries another. Or you can have, pods of information you're delivering, and then Theo and I, or whoever else you're interviewing, kind of are both dipping in. So there's a lot of ways. I do find it very helpful to actually write it out and then use that to rearrange in your script. And I also sometimes will literally organize, once you're in Premiere or wherever you are, organize into bins, topically organize into a bin, and then have Theo just by himself, and then start putting things into timelines and just see, okay, when I put all of my interviews, all of my subject matter around a certain set of things into one place, how do they start to speak to each other? What's coming?
So what would you say you love most about documentaries over other types of film?
For me, what I love about documentary is that I find myself in so many different worlds. I dip into the world of small town girls basketball. I'm suddenly spending a lot of time with vets from Iraq and Afghanistan who are coming home with various injuries. I peer into worlds that I otherwise wouldn't go into in that same way. And because I'm looking for patterns and looking at how to connect things and really trying to get to the bottom of what people are really trying to express, I look at it in a different way than I would if I was reading someone else's book. I think when you're engaged in the process of trying to make a story yourself and compress information and share with your audience something fresh and new, you're interacting with whatever it is that is the subject of your documentary in a different way than you would watching someone else's work, having a conversation with one person on a topic, or even in a different way than you might if you were, coming into something with a really clear vision of a particular advocacy that you wanted to do. So I love seeing into worlds with very little agenda, places that I might not see at all.
So what would you say are some of the most difficult challenges that you've faced over the years when making documentaries, and what challenges do you normally have just when filming documentaries in general?
I'd say challenges, the challenges I face with documentary, they're kind of in two different categories. The first I would just say is like a really logistical, what happens when you're making stories about a real world. You never know when the big trucks are coming by, the airplanes are overhead, whether someone's gonna show up in a good mood and ready to, be there and really tell you their story in the way you might want. You can't plan in the way that you might be able to if you were shooting fiction film. I think the second set of challenges really comes with the fact that, especially when you're telling someone else's story in your documentary, someone gives you their story and then you're responsible for caring for it, right? As you know, when you edit, you can make someone say almost anything with editing tools. And I feel like at the point where I've asked someone to tell me their story, I have a responsibility to do my best not to take it out of context, to tell it honestly, to tell it in a way that does no harm. And that's responsibility I try to take seriously.
So another person that I've interviewed for this project is Theo Lipford, and I understand that you've worked with Theo Lipford, so I'd like if you could maybe describe when you first worked with Theo and kind of what projects you worked on and stuff like that.
Yeah, Theo Lipford, he created all the graphics for my first documentary, Class C. He created these great map graphics that kind of showed where each of the communities were located, kind of flew you around the state of Montana. And then I've also watched various of Theo's projects over the years, as he's created projects for Montana PBS. He's done a lot of things where he's working overseas and a lot of really interesting projects. I think collaboration is really important in the film community. It's hard to make a documentary by yourself, period. And it's really easy to become blind when you're making something. You have a vision for how you think something's going to work or connect or come out, and I always think it's really important to get feedback from other people, because in the end, you could sit and say, well, I meant for this to do this and work in this way and talk all day to someone that you're watching something with, but the truth is, video is meant for an audience that's remote from you. So the reactions people have, I always try to take them really seriously. Now, sometimes people react to something and it's like they don't know exactly what they're reacting to. They might think they don't like this, but when you really listen to them, it's like something bigger that they're really pointing to in their criticism. But I think, really taking, you certainly have to go your own way, but taking critical review, I just think is so helpful in the process of making documentary, because especially when you shoot and edit and write on your own, it's so easy to become blind. You're trying to accomplish a goal, you don't always get there, and it really takes trusting someone else to show you when you've gone askew. So I've really valued my relationships with other filmmakers and just with friends, people who I trust to just give me their real reactions. The most recent documentary that I completed is called Not Yet Begun to Fight. It's a story about 5 vets from Iraq and Afghanistan who come here to the Gallatin Valley and to the valleys surrounding and go fly fishing on rivers. We went from the hospital to Montana and followed them, and then followed them back into their lives as they continued to heal. I've worked for a long time. Start a new sentence for you, got a point.
That's fine.
I've worked for a long time on various television natural history programs, things for National Geographic, and I continue to work doing that kind of nonfiction editing and writing, especially producing as well.
So who would you say are some of your role models when it comes to filmmaking? Like, what documentaries have you watched in the past that have really inspired you? What documentary filmmakers have inspired you?
It's interesting. Are you on again? Yes. It's funny. I think about my inspirations are not always from documentary. I think I go from a wide range of storytelling inspirations. I love radio. I love just the pure, what happens when you have the simplicity in some ways of audio. I think there's a lot of other challenges that happen too, but I love listening to Ira Glass talk about the challenges in making stories that sound true. I love him describing his own transition from being a really stilted NPR news delivery person to learning how to find his own voice. I love a really wide range of documentaries. And it sort of changes depending on what I'm thinking about. But some of my favorite documentaries. Let me start this over.
That's totally fine.
Yeah.
I've already got some good stuff, but yeah, I'll just edit together. So
absolutely. When I'm dealing with a project, I like to look to people who have taken on structural challenges that are like the challenges I'm making. I must have watched Spellbound 100 times when I was making Class C, because you have a very particular kind of thing happening when you are having a bunch of characters sort of go to an ultimate challenge, right? So you have that kind of mounting competition arc. Murderball is something I watched a lot then. It was interesting because even if you're telling a sports story, in the end, you also have to be telling people stories. So looking at how you keep a character building across an arc of what is a sports doc or a competition doc was an interesting thing to watch in Murderball. I don't know if you've seen that. It's about wheelchair athletes that play a version of sort of rugby. It's really amazing, but you're kind of introduced to a variety of people who have had very severe physical injuries and are still involved in this really competitive and kind of violent sport. But you're seeing characters and competition simultaneously. People who I love in terms of just visuals, Manda Bala, have you seen that film? It's Brazilian and it's about a frog farm and plastic surgery, and it's actually made by a friend of mine, Jason Cohn. It's just a beautiful documentary. It's so cinematic. I feel like at this point, people are able to bridge the worlds because of camera technology. Actually, this is something interesting. When I started making documentaries, we were in SD. That was just the world, the digital world. We were so lucky that we could afford to carry the cameras around that we were. But it was just you had these HVX, nothing cameras. No, it wasn't even. I think that's even to HD. But we had just standard definition cameras. Our limitations with regard to light and depth of field were absolutely maximal. And in these 10 years, now you can be sitting here with a pretty good lens on a camera that lets you record in HD, and your options in terms of what you can capture visually are just radically different. So it's fun to watch how people have played with that. Of course, there have been documentaries made for a long time on film. Real film, shot on film. So that there have been people have been accessing that kind of visual quality for a long time, but it wasn't accessible to everyone. I think you, right now, can make a film that's as beautiful as almost anyone can, and that's a massive change in technology. Of course, you still have to learn the craft, but I remember feeling when I started making films just really, in some ways, limited. There were limits to what I could access, and financially, big limits. And it's just really nice to see now really everyone has the tools to make a beautiful story. Yes, you have to spend a ton of time watching tutorials and Googling things, but ultimately you have access to creating things at a pretty high quality. It's funny that Theo mentioned sound, because I actually think sound can be even a bigger challenge sometimes when you're breaking in than the visuals, because if you have a good DSLR camera, you can get really pretty fantastic images. Getting the sound to kind of work with that is a slightly different challenge. That is not about who inspired me, but I do think that that's an interesting shift that's happened.
No, it's great.
In the time that I've made films. I'm trying to think more specifically about inspirations, but I really think the way that I tend to consume documentary is that I, as I'm working on things, go and try to find people who are working with similar kinds of problems structurally, and then watch and ignore them all as well. You're mentioning being more interested in watching behind the scenes than watching fiction itself. And we've gotten to a point with fiction that we can create almost anything. And it's in these digital worlds very often. They can make almost anything. There's something about behind the scenes is connecting you to a reel. And I think we've gotten to this point where that connection to something authentic that we feel is relatable, we can read, we search for that as much as anything. And I think in terms of entertainment, there's certainly a new wave of we have so much virtual, and nonfiction ties you back into something accessible where you're using the tools that we've evolved to use in terms of understanding things as I don't want to say true, but as relatable, and as learning things from things that are relatable. Nonfiction takes you back there. So I totally understand the magic behind the magic. The real behind the magic is in a lot of ways more mesmerizing. And I think particularly at this cultural moment where we really, we're right on the edge of being able to create virtual realities that are just as tangible as, and in many ways we already do. I think we're kind of shying away from that in some ways because it's gone so far. So I think nonfiction is going to continue to have a really strong place for a long time. But I also think there's a lot of possibility for doing, you can do nonfiction and virtual simultaneously. Theo all the time is doing really complicated interventions with his footage that are digital in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, and you can almost go the other way too, because there's also been a rise in mockumentaries.
Totally.
And
where you're using that
fiction, using a non-fiction style for a fictional story.
Yeah, because we hunger for that. No, yes, Bernie. Have you seen Bernie?
I don't think so.
Oh my gosh, you have to see it. Just see it. It's so good. Yeah. Real story, some real interviews. It's totally amazing. That I would say is an inspiration. And actually, I love that. I actually even like mixed form things where you're kind of between real interviews and with recreations, but done not in a recreation way, but in a full-on fiction. Watch Bernie. So good.
Well, because I like movies like This Is Spinal Tap. I thought that was
so good. Yes. when
Yeah.
doing the next, reel. And you're right, even if you knew that was a mockumentary, it's still fun to see that texture, the vampire thing, whatever it is about ordinary life that just feels relatable.